Your name is Toby. You're going to learn to say your name. Let me hear you say it. What's your name?
Kunta Kinte.
Black names have changed over the centuries. Despite this, most people recognize that there are first names given almost exclusively by Black Americans to their children, such as Jamal and Latasha. But why?
Latifah, Shaniqua, Latoya, LaQuisha, Lakeisha, Latonya, Rohandra, Bonquisha, Shatanya, Tapromination, LaQuishria, Bonifa.
While often the subject of jokes and social commentary, many believe that these distinctively Black names are a recent trend. However, research proves otherwise. Long before Jamal and Latasha, there were names like Booker and Pearlie. The names may have evolved, but the tradition of using distinctive Black names dates back to the earliest days of American history. Many scholars argue that distinctively Black names arose from the Civil Rights era and are likely influenced by the Black Power movement and the Black cultural resurgence of the 1990s as a way to affirm and embrace Black identity. Before this time, the argument goes, Blacks and whites had similar naming patterns. However, historical evidence challenges this belief. Until recently, the story of Black names largely relied on data from the 1960s onward. However, the digitization of census records and newly accessible birth and death records from earlier periods have enabled scholars to go deeper into the history of Black names. For instance, research by Ohio State University's Trevon Logan and his colleagues on the 1920 census revealed that 99% of men named Booker were Black, as well as 80% of men named Pearlie. The proportion of Black individuals with a distinctively Black name in the early 1900s was around 3%, similar to the percentage at the end of the 20th century. Interestingly, the Black names of the late 1800s and early 1900s are not the same Black names that we recognize today. The historical names that stand out are predominantly biblical, like Elijah, Isaac, Isaiah, Moses, and Abraham. Additionally, names that evoke power and empowerment, such as Prince, King, and Freeman, are also popular choices. These names are quite different from Black names today, such as Tyrone, Darnell, and Kareem, which grew in popularity during the Civil Rights Movement. Now that we know Black names were in use long before the Civil Rights era, it raises the question of how these names emerged and what they represented. To explore this, let's look back to the antebellum era, the period before the Civil War, and see if distinctively Black names were present before the emancipation of enslaved people. Because the census didn't document the names of enslaved Africans, researchers turned to records from slave markets and ship manifests to uncover those names. By examining these new data sources, researchers discovered that names like Alonzo, Israel, Presley, and Titus were common among Black Americans both before and after emancipation. They also found that roughly 3% of Black Americans had distinctively Black names during the antebellum period, a percentage similar to that found after the Civil War. But what stands out most is the trend observed during the period of enslavement. The share of Black Americans with distinctively Black names increased throughout the antebellum era, while the share of white Americans with those same names dropped from over 3% during the American Revolution to less than 1% by 1860. By the time the Civil War was approaching, the distinct racial naming pattern that characterized the late 1800s was already firmly established in the U.S. Truly, Black names give us a glimpse into the development of Black culture and the steps whites took to distance themselves from it. Scholars like Lawrence W. Levine, Herbert Gutman, and Ralph Ellison have long argued that the formation of African American culture is linked to the family and social connections among diverse ethnic groups within the African diaspora. How this culture developed and persisted in a chattel slavery system is a unique historical development. Estimates suggest that around 30 to 40% of those kidnapped from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade were Muslim and likely had Arabic names. Those who were neither Muslim nor Christian had names from their own cultural traditions. Upon arriving in America, many of the earliest enslaved individuals tried to retain their original or ethnic names, but one of the easiest ways to dehumanize them and break their spirits was to strip away their names and replace them with new ones. This is famously portrayed in the 1977 miniseries Roots.
Your name is Toby. You're going to learn to say your name. Let me hear you say it. What's your name?
Kunta Kinte.
Enslaved individuals often acquired their last names from their enslavers. The derogatory N-word, originally a neutral name among Hausa people in West Africa, was transformed into a slur during the colonial era. Many enslaved individuals were given classical names like Virgil, Hannibal, Titus, Hercules, Phoebe, Venus, and Daphne. These names, while common among enslaved people, were less frequent among white populations. Some historians suggest that slaveholders may have chosen these names to demonstrate their own erudition or to mock the irony of naming enslaved individuals after powerful historical figures. The name Venus was particularly popular among enslaved black women and reflected the fetishization of black female sexuality by European slave owners. This name, derived from the Roman goddess of love, was used to objectify and dehumanize enslaved women. A late 18th century engraving called The Voyage of the Sable Venus from Angola to the West Indies vividly illustrates this disturbing trend. Here it is in comparison with Botticelli's Venus. Over time, especially during the Great Awakening, enslaved people began to receive increasingly European and Christian names like Elijah and Moses. The naming practices varied depending on the enslaver. Some allowed enslaved people to choose their children's names, while others did not. Early records from South Carolina, where the Gullah Geechee culture was prominent, revealed distinctly African names. These records also show that groups named their children after days of the week in West African languages that match their birthdays. According to Nick Butler, names like Quash for Sunday, Kujo for Monday, Bena for Tuesday, and Quam for Saturday were used. It was common for black people to have nicknames for family and friends, and runaway notices sometimes included both country names and nicknames. Butler also mentioned that in 1748, an enslaver in Charleston advertised for the return of two Angolan men. One was named Moses, but went by the country name Mono, while the other was named Samson, but had the country name Gomo. As black people fought for their freedom through immense struggle, including running away and becoming abolitionists, many changed their names to distance themselves from their enslavers. For example, Araminta Ross, known as Minty in runaway notices, took on the name Harriet Tubman, adopting her husband's last name during a time when enslaved marriages were not officially recognized. Similarly, Isabella Baumfree became Sojourner Truth. In 1838, as he escaped, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey had already abandoned his two middle names and was known as Frederick Stanley and Johnson. However, in New Bedford, where there were already many Johnsons, he asked the abolitionist he was staying with to choose a new name for him, specifying that it must include Frederick to maintain his sense of identity. The name Douglas was selected from a Scottish poem. Interestingly, even during and after slavery, some black people chose to adopt the surnames of their former masters, or name their children after American heroes like George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Abraham Lincoln. Additionally, the 1880 census revealed that a quarter of black households had sons named after their fathers. By the early 1900s, certain first names became notably common among black Americans, but were rarely used by white Americans. These names included Abraham, Alonzo, Percy, Pearlie, Prince, Israel, Isaiah, Presley, Cell, and Titus. Trevon Logan notes that these names had been widely popular among black people for a long time and were frequently recorded on ship manifests between 1719 and 1820. By the time of emancipation, African American naming practices had become national in scope and were deeply connected to the history of the slave trade, continuing throughout the 1800s. Throughout the 1800s, African American culture developed naming practices that were widespread by the time of emancipation and closely tied to the history of the slave trade. In fact, 3% of enslaved people had names that were uniquely black, not used by white people, and this proportion remained consistent into the 1920s. As the 20th century progressed, black men began adopting names with distinct European origins, such as Germain from French and Latin, Darnell from Anglo-Saxon, Leroy from the Normans, and Tyrone from the Irish. Sociologist Nubal Niles Puckett gathered thousands of unique black names spanning from 1619 to the 1940s. In his 1975 work, Posthumous Black Names in America, Puckett compiled a list of these distinctive names. Many of these names are beloved classics, while others are intriguing forgotten gems. Familiar names include Alexa, Algra, Angelface, Asia, and Beauty. Unique names stand out, like Beauty Love, Beautiful Swindler, and Beauty Marcel, alongside timeless choices such as Cinderella, Cleopatra, and Doll Baby. The list also features names like Easter Belle, Elvire, and various forms of queen. Interestingly, Hannah appears with 32 entries, making it significantly more popular than the other names on the list. Now, if you're underestimating the significance of black people choosing their own names, consider Cassius Clay changing his name into Muhammad Ali. Clay took this new name after converting to Islam.
Oh, Clay was not my name. Clay was a white man's name. It was a slave name. And I'm no longer Clay, I'm no longer a slave, so now Muhammad Ali.
He wanted to move away from the name given to him by his father, who was named after a Kentucky abolitionist and politician. Both white and black individuals resisted this change and refused to call him Muhammad Ali. Ali taunted an opponent between punches as he challenged his opponent to acknowledge his new name. Despite this, the opponent stubbornly called him Clay. Ali's success, confidence, and his controversial refusal to be drafted for the Vietnam War made him a pariah in the 1960s, just as much as his name change did. He was criticized as arrogant and overconfident, with people deliberately using the name Cassius Clay to undermine his autonomy and accomplishments. During the promotional period for the 1971 fight known as the Fight of the Century, Joe Frazier, a professional boxer, continued to call Ali Clay. This led Ali to accuse Frazier of being an Uncle Tom and a race traitor. Ali questioned why Frazier persisted in using his old name when even the most hostile white opponents acknowledged him as Muhammad Ali. These two had a long-standing feud, partly because Frazier defeated Ali in their match, and Ali didn't follow through on his vow to crawl across the ring and call Frazier the greatest. While Ali's name change was one of the most prominent and debated, many black individuals during the 60s and 70s were changing their names as part of the Afrocentric movement and the broader civil rights and black power movements. Malcolm Little adopted the name Malcolm X in the 40s, with the X representing his lost African surname. Black Panther and future best-selling musician Yvette Marie Stevens received the name Chaka at age 13 from a Yoruba priest. Stokely Carmichael became Kwame Ture, though he used both names throughout his life. Politician Frizzell Gerard Tate changed his name to Kwesi Mfume. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, formerly Lou Alcindor, began using his new name publicly in 1971 after his conversion to Islam. Interestingly, Bill Cosby and Muhammad Ali were close friends, yet their perspectives on names diverged sharply. In Cosby's infamous 2004 Pound Cake speech, delivered before the NAACP to mark the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, he criticized names associated with African heritage. He remarked,
"We are not Africans. Those people are not Africans. They don't know a thing about Africa," with names like Shaniqua, Shalua, Muhammad, and all that crap, and all of them are in jail. When we give these kinds of names to our children, we give them the strength and inspiration in the meaning of those names. What's the point of giving them strong names if there is no parenting and values backing it up?
On one hand, Cosby seemed to acknowledge that names could be powerful, but he may have realized his mistake when he conflated Shaniqua and Shaligua, names he was targeting in his speech on respectability politics, with Muhammad, an ancient Arabic and Islamic name held by one of his close friends. Nevertheless, the wave of name changes among celebrities, activists, and intellectuals in the 1960s led to a shift in naming trends. Before this era, differences in naming patterns between white and black people were subtle, with distinctively black names being relatively rare. In the late 1990s and 2000s, there was a slight rise in black parents choosing names traditionally associated with white people for their children, but creative names, especially for black girls, remained popular. Consider the case of 9-year-old Kuvinshan Wallace, who corrected Ricky Gervais for mispronouncing her name. Such incidents are more common than one might expect. A 2004 study by Roland G. Fryer and Stephen D. Levitt found that nearly 1/3 of African American girls in California were given unique names. While these names did not notably affect their quality of life, they were more prevalent among lower-income families. Meanwhile, a 2021 study from the University of Chicago and the University of California, Berkeley, discovered that individuals with black names had a 2.1% lower chance of being contacted for job opportunities. As the country continues to grapple with the wide-ranging effects of enslavement in the nation's history, we cannot and should not forget that enslavement played a huge role in the development of black culture as we understand it today. While black names are becoming more widely accepted, discrimination and prejudice continue to exist. The choice of names remains a reflection of our society's evolving history, culture, and values. Thank you for joining us as we explored the surprising history of Black names. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content. Now we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced the influence of your name on job opportunities or encountered any form of discrimination? Share your opinions and experiences in the comments and keep the discussion going. We'll see you in the next video.